He was once the face of an entire generation, his voice echoing across MTV, his presence exploding on stage. Yet in the end, Scott Weiland died quietly, alone, inside a tour bus parked in the cold. How does someone go from sold-out stadiums and platinum albums to a lifeless body far from the spotlight? His story is not only about glory, but about the battle with demons that fame itself carved deeper. Friends called him a genius. Fans thought he was untouchable. But behind the music were cracks, secrets, and a chain of choices that could never be undone. Some say it was destiny. Others believe the industry abandoned him long before the end. The truth lies in the contradictions. And the question still lingers. Was that death simply the inevitable end of a storm-filled life, or a tragedy that might have been prevented? Stay with us. Chapter 1. A Hard Childhood and the Prophecy, I Will Die Young. At only 12 years old, Scott once blurted out to a friend, "I will die young." It seemed like a careless remark, but that friend never forgot it. Not because of the words, but because of the way Scott said them. His eyes turned away, his voice low, as if he were reading out a sentence already carved into his life. Scott Weiland grew up in a working-class family in California. His parents divorced early, and he lived mostly with his mother. His father's absence left an emptiness that was never fully filled. Neighbors recalled how young Scott would often sit quietly on the front steps, staring at the passing cars, his eyes distant as though he were somewhere else. Many people later remembered that detail. Scott's eyes never seemed to stay still, even after he became a star. But there was a darker shadow in that boy's past. Scott later admitted that at the age of 5, he had been abused by a stranger. It was a secret he buried for decades. When he finally revealed it in an interview, audiences understood more clearly why he carried a lifelong unease that no one could name. That pain wasn't just a memory. It was like an invisible lock, keeping him trapped in his own dark room. At school, Scott was quiet, withdrawn, and an easy target for bullies. Teachers remembered that he avoided eye contact, rarely joining in group games. An old friend once recalled, even when he smiled, he looked away, as if there was a scar in his mind no one was allowed to touch. Music became his only escape. The first time he stood at a microphone in a school band, Scott seemed to explode with energy. Singing gave him a way to scream out the things he couldn't say. But what struck people as strange was that, even when his voice roared with power, his eyes still carried that look of escape. It was a paradox that would haunt him his entire life. The brighter he shone on stage, the more lost he seemed backstage. What troubles people most is how that 12-year-old prophecy never felt like coincidence. It seemed like the instinct of a boy, wounded too early, who could only see life as a short road. And perhaps that vague belief unconsciously steered Scott, pushing him into the reckless choices that defined his later years. Did Scott Weiland somehow know his destiny? Or was that prophecy simply the echo of a childhood shadow, one he never truly escaped? Chapter 2. Heroine, Inspiration or Death Sentence. In the late 1980s, Scott Weiland stumbled into music almost by chance. He met bassist Robert DeLeo at a small party. The two discovered they had once dated the same girl. Instead of becoming rivals, they laughed it off. Not long after, they began making music together, an encounter that seemed trivial at the time, but one that opened the door to destiny. In those early rehearsals inside a shabby garage, Scott stood before the microphone, eyes closed, voice straining as if tearing through a curtain that had long hidden his inner life. Friends who witnessed it were stunned. We had never seen anyone turn pain into sound like that. For Scott, singing was not entertainment. It was a cry for help. The music of Stone Temple Pilots spread quickly. Their melodies were more accessible than Nirvana, yet darker than Pearl Jam. At the height of grunge, Scott managed to ride the wave while remaining just different enough that audiences couldn't look away. MTV soon broadcast his image across America. A magnetic voice, a rebel, a star born straight out of the shadows. But light always brings shadow. From the very beginning, Scott turned to alcohol and drugs. Friends recalled that even when the band was still playing to only a handful of bar patrons, he drank so much that he slurred his voice. Once, when caught using heroin in the rehearsal room, he shrugged and said, "It helps me stay quiet, at least inside my head." That was when the rumors began. Some believed that without heroin, there would never have been Plush, the song that catapulted Stone Temple Pilots to the top. Others swore heroin was nothing less than a death sentence written in advance. To the public, Scott Weiland became a living paradox. His brilliance on stage could not be separated from the wounds he carried inside. Behind the endless music videos on MTV, his tousled hair, his burning eyes, Scott often vanished after shows, locking himself away, leaving his bandmates anxious and uncertain. One member admitted, "There were nights we thought Scott had disappeared for good." Even at his brightest, fear followed him like a shadow. It was this dual image, fiery artist on stage, fugitive soul in life, that defined Scott Weiland. And it was here that his dream carried its curse. The higher he soared, the tighter the darkness closed in. The road to glory had already begun to sketch out the price he would one day pay. Chapter 3: The Legendary Spotlight and Its Dark Price. By the early 1990s, as Scott Weiland stepped fully into legend, those closest to him realized the terrible cost of that light. The album Core sold millions. MTV replayed Plush endlessly. Scott had become the new face of a generation. At a young age, he stood alongside giants like Kurt Cobain, Eddie Vedder, and Chris Cornell. But while Cobain came across as ascetic in his frayed sweaters, Scott was different. He craved luxury. Soon, he moved into a sprawling home in the Hollywood Hills, with a turquoise blue pool reflecting the glow of all-night parties. Parked out front were Porsches, Ferraris, even a vintage Corvette, lined up like his own private showroom. For many fans, this was proof that Scott had escaped his humble beginnings. But to close friends, it was only a shell, covering an insecurity that had never left him. Offstage, Scott also searched for escape in love. With Mary Forsberg, the beautiful model who later became his wife, he tried to build a family. On rare, quiet days, they sat together in their garden, playing with their dogs, talking about the future. In those fleeting moments, he seemed like an ordinary man again, longing for peace, stability, and happiness. Yet Mary would later become the most painful witness to his spiral, unable to stop the descent. On stage, Scott was a predator, wild, magnetic, provocative. He wore crystal crowns, draped himself in fur, and turned each performance into a kind of ceremony. The crowds watched spellbound as he slithered against the microphone stand, his voice raw and torn but still hypnotic. At times, under the spotlight, it felt as though audiences were witnessing a new David Bowie for the grunge era. But behind the curtain, the truth was very different. Bandmates recalled nights when Scott disappeared minutes before showtime. They would find him collapsed in a bathroom, needles still in sight. "There were nights we thought the show was finished before it began," one member admitted. And yet, somehow, he would rise, straighten his jacket, and step out as if nothing had happened. It was two men in one body, the glamorous Scott Weiland the world adored, and the lost soul consumed by darkness. They existed side by side, draining the life out of each other. The audience saw only the light, but those closest knew. The star was already burning himself away. And it was in those very years of triumph that the haunting question arose. Was that brilliance simply hiding a fire that was already burning too fast? Chapter 4: From superstar to troublemaker in the eyes of his bandmates. In the middle of the spotlight, darkness began to consume Scott Weiland. By the late 1990s, the headlines were no longer about his music, but about his spectacular falls. Once the seductive face of MTV, he was now on the front page wearing handcuffs, his eyes weary, with bold captions screaming, "Rock star in free fall." There were nights when Scott was arrested for driving under the influence. On another occasion, police discovered heroin in his car. Mugshots spread across the press, hair greasy, face hollowed, showing the world in stark detail an icon unraveling. Fans who once worshipped him now began to question, could Scott even save himself? Rumors multiplied. Some said the stage was no longer a joy for Scott, but a sentence, that every time he stood before tens of thousands of people, he felt nothing but pressure and emptiness. Others swore that heroin had become his real partner on stage, the only constant presence when the lights went down. Inside the band, tensions exploded. Rehearsals turned into battlegrounds. Some days, Scott arrived hours late, trembling, unable to sing. The band erupted in shouting matches. At times, they were forced to cancel entire tours midway, something unheard of for a group at their peak. To the public, Stone Temple Pilots looked like a sinking ship, and their frontman was the drunken captain dragging them down. At home, Mary Forsberg, the woman who once dreamed of happiness with Scott, became an unwilling casualty. In her later memoir, she admitted that life beside him was chaos. Nights when he vanished for days, phone calls from the police, and endless attempts to piece together what remained of their family. And yet, here lies the paradox. The deeper the scandals surrounded him, the more powerful his music seemed to become. In songs like Interstate Love Song or Big Empty, his voice sounded like the cry of a chained soul. Fans, even as they knew his personal life was collapsing, could not look away from the haunting performances that came out of his pain. Scott once admitted in an interview, "I've been to jail. I've destroyed everything. But at least I still have music. It's the only thing that hasn't betrayed me." But everyone knew that was only half the truth. Music kept him alive, yes, but it also pulled him deeper into the abyss. From this point on, Scott Weiland's path was no longer one of rising triumph. It became a spiral, glorious and shattered at the same time, an unstoppable descent. Chapter 5, Love, Betrayal, and Scars That Never Healed. On December 12, 2015, a tour bus belonging to the band, the Wildabouts, sat quietly outside a hotel in Bloomington, Minnesota. Inside, the other members noticed something strange. Scott's door remained closed, with no sound coming from within. When they finally forced it open, the scene broke them. Scott lay motionless, eyes shut, his body already cold. The news spread like a blade, cutting through the memory of an entire generation. Headlines read, "Scott Weiland dead at 48. But to those who had followed him from the beginning, it felt less like news and more like the fulfillment of a destiny long written. Some believed he'd been taken by his old companion, heroin. The autopsy confirmed the presence of drugs and alcohol. Yet immediately, whispers began. Some fans swore that on his last night, Scott had been sober, quietly writing in a notebook found by his bedside. Others claimed there was a letter in the room, never made public, scribbled in shaky handwriting, as if he had something left unsaid. The press seized the moment, revisiting his final months. The band broken apart, recording contracts severed, Scott pushed out of the very ship he had built. One outlet declared Weiland had been dead for years, the body just hadn't caught up yet. Even darker questions emerged. Had Scott been abandoned? Had his management team, so used to seeing him collapse, grown numb to the urgency of calling for help? Among fans, some insisted Scott didn't die from heroin. He died from being forgotten. His funeral, strangely, lacked the aura of a legend. There were no tens of thousands of fans, no live television coverage. Only a small group of friends, family, and a few old colleagues gathered to say goodbye. On top of the casket, a single red rose was laid. It rested there in silence, much like Scott's departure. No fireworks, no screams, only the echo of a life filled with torment. But for his fans, Scott Weiland never became just another singer lost to addiction. He became a tragic symbol, an artist whose every song now feels like a prophecy of his own fate. Chapter 6, Death on the Tour Bus, Abandonment or Fate. After Scott Weiland's death, his music carried a different weight. Songs that once dominated MTV and radio now sounded like pre-written elegies. Plush, with its somber melody, Creep, with its words of self-reproach, Interstate Love Song, haunted by themes of lies and betrayal. Listened to today, each feels like a fragment of a despairing diary. hidden inside distorted guitar lines and a raspy, aching voice. One critic wrote, "Weiland didn't just sing about pain, he lived inside it, and in the end, he was buried by it." But his legacy cannot be confined to the manner of his death. Scott Weiland defined a generation. He stepped onto the stage not as a conventional rock frontman, but as a shape-shifting artist. Sometimes a drifter, draped in fur. Sometimes a silent movie figure in a mask, at times wild, at times coldly seductive. That constant transformation captivated audiences while also leaving them unsettled. It was art that mirrored his own life. Beautiful, yet fragile. Brilliant, yet self-destructive. At the same time, Scott's story became a bitter lesson for the industry. Critics called him the embodiment of the American rock spiral. Success, addiction, recovery, relapse. Record labels, collaborators, even loyal fans were forced to face a troubling question. They had celebrated the glow of his fame, but had anyone truly reached out to pull him from the abyss? And then there are the details still cloaked in mystery. The notebook found in the room where he died disappeared without a trace. Rumors of a suicide letter never shown to anyone outside police hands. Some insist the words inside did not just reveal despair, but also carried accusations that he had been abandoned, betrayed by the very friends and industry that once cheered his rise. These unanswered gaps turned Scott's death into a half-hidden tragedy, part fact, part haunting question. Today, Scott Weiland is often mentioned alongside Kurt Cobain, Lane Staley, and Chris Cornell, stars who carried both brilliance and self-destruction. But unlike them, Scott left behind a trail of unanswered questions. His end was not one single dramatic moment, but a drawn-out tragedy, repeating itself until it closed quietly on a darkened bus. And perhaps it is that ambiguity that keeps him alive in memory. With Scott Weiland, the question is not only why he died, but also who allowed him to die that way. And maybe, only by daring to confront that question, can we fully understand both the value and the cost of the light called rock and roll. Epilogue: Scott Weiland. Eternal legend or forgotten tragedy? Scott Weiland's life did not close with a scream on stage, but with a chilling silence on a tour bus, surrounded by empty beer cans, scattered pill bottles, and a body that could fight no longer. Another chapter of rock and roll came to a mournful end. And yet, for a man who once made tens of thousands shake to his every note, his death brought an unsettling quiet. Quiet, but never gone. Because the moment Plush, Interstate Love Song, or Fall to Pieces is played, that trembling, fierce voice rises again, like a shadow that refuses to vanish. His music became his will. The pain in his lyrics, proof of a soul that lived fully, but left scarred. Some believe Scott left behind his diary in the form of songs. Each track a warning, each chorus a prophecy. Others whisper that he didn't simply collapse from self-destruction, but because he had been left too long in neglect by the industry that once hailed him, by bandmates who once stood at his side, perhaps even by those closest to him. That gray area, that unresolved silence, turned his death into a wound that is never healed. And then, there is that haunting childhood memory. At just 12 years old, Scott once told a friend, "I will die young." At the time, it seemed like a passing remark. Today, it feels like the final refrain, closing the cycle of a star who burned brightly and then faded too soon. Now, fans still argue. Did Scott Weiland write his own sentence? Or was it a fate imposed by a world that praised, used, and finally forgot him? The question has no answer, and perhaps it never will. But every time that voice echoes in a darkened room, we are reminded that behind the glory of fame, there can exist a solitude so cold it outlasts even the music.